The snow was fallen in thick, silent sheets over the Montana wilderness, blanketing the world in a pristine white that felt almost sacred. Jake Mercer stood on the porch of his rented cabin, watching the flakes drift through the beam of his flashlight like ghosts dancing in the dark. The air was so cold it burned his lungs, but he welcomed it. Cold was real. Cold was honest. Cold didn't lie. Jake Mercer was a Navy SEAL, 36 years old, built with the dense, functional muscle of a man who had spent 15 years operating in the world's most hostile environments. His face was weathered beyond his years, carved with hard lines around his eyes and mouth. Lines that came from squinting into desert suns and forcing smiles when his soul felt empty. He was on mandatory leave, pulled from active duty after a mission in Yemen that had gone catastrophically wrong. Not operationally wrong, they'd completed the objective. But the cost. The cost was something Jake couldn't stop calculating. He exhaled, watching his breath crystallize in the freezing air. The remote Montana cabin was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place so isolated that the world couldn't find him. The nearest town, Whitefish, was 40 miles of treacherous mountain roads away. Out here, there was no cell service, no internet, no noise, just the wind through the pines and the endless, suffocating quiet. At his feet sat Thor, a magnificent Belgian Malinois with a coat the color of burnished copper and black. Thor was not a pet. He was Jake's partner, a military working dog trained in explosives detection and tactical assault. The dog's intelligent amber eyes missed nothing, his ears constantly swiveling, processing every sound the forest offered. Thor had been with Jake for 4 years, through 3 deployments. They had a bond that went beyond words, a connection forged in fire and blood. "Just you and me out here, bud," Jake murmured, reaching down to scratch behind Thor's ears. The dog leaned into his hand, a rare moment of softness in an otherwise disciplined existence. Jake turned back inside, closing the heavy wooden door against the storm. The cabin was small, one main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a loft bedroom accessible by a rough-hewn ladder. It smelled of pine smoke and old wood, a smell that should have been comforting. Instead, it just felt empty. He had been here for 5 days, and the quiet was destroying him. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. In the teams, silence meant death was close. It meant you were in the last seconds before contact, when every nerve was alive, every sense screaming for information. Here, the silence was just nothing. And in that nothing, Jake's mind filled the void with memories he desperately wanted to forget. The mission, the village, the choice he'd been forced to make. He shook his head violently, as if he could physically dislodge the images. He walked to the fireplace and threw another log onto the flames, watching sparks spiral up the chimney. Thor, ever vigilant, had already taken up his position by the door, his head resting on his paws but his eyes open, watching. Jake tried to read. He tried to sleep. He tried to just exist without the constant drumbeat of adrenaline and purpose, but every attempt felt hollow. He was a weapon without a war, and it was eating him alive. The snow continued to fall outside, piling up against the windows, transforming the world into a white tomb. 70 miles away, in a luxurious lodge on the outskirts of Whitefish, another kind of storm was brewing. Meredith Hayes sat in the corner of the resort's grand library, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She was a striking woman in her early 30s, with dark auburn hair pulled back in an elegant twist and the kind of classical features that turned heads. But her eyes, deep green and haunted, told a different story. They were the eyes of someone who had learned that beauty could be a cage. She wore an expensive cashmere sweater and designer jeans, clothes that whispered wealth and privilege. On her left hand, a massive diamond engagement ring caught the firelight, throwing rainbows across the polished wood of the table. It was beautiful. It was also a shackle. Her fiancé, Marcus Blackwell, stood across the room, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, controlled murmur as he conducted business even here, even on what was supposed to be their romantic pre-wedding getaway. Marcus was 42, handsome in the way that money could buy, perfect teeth, perfect hair, perfect tailored clothes. He was a venture capitalist, a man who made his fortune buying struggling companies, stripping them for parts, and selling what remained. He was ruthless, brilliant, and utterly in control of everything, including her. Meredith touched the fading bruise on her wrist, hidden beneath the sleeve of her sweater. She had learned to hide them well, the marks, the fear, the small deaths that accumulated each time Marcus's charm slipped and revealed the monster beneath. She had tried to leave once, 3 months ago. She had packed a bag, taken her car, and made it as far as the airport before Marcus's security team had found her. Marcus had been understanding, of course. He had held her, stroked her hair, and explained, so patiently, so lovingly, that she was just confused, that the wedding stress was getting to her, that she needed rest. And then he had locked her in their penthouse for a week. For her own safety, he said. She had learned her lesson. Now, sitting in this beautiful lodge, surrounded by other wealthy couples enjoying their perfect Montana ski vacation, Meredith felt the walls closing in again. Marcus had planned everything about this trip, where they stayed, what they ate when they slept. He had even chosen her clothes each morning, laying them out on the bed with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This will be our last adventure before the wedding," he had said. "Just you and me, sweetheart. No distractions." What he meant was no escape. Marcus ended his call and crossed the room, his movement smooth and predatory. He placed a hand on her shoulder and she forced herself not to flinch. "Ready for dinner, darling." His voice was warm, affectionate. To anyone watching, they were the perfect couple. "Of course," she said, her voice steady, her smile practiced. As they walked to the dining room, Marcus's hand on the small of her back, guiding, controlling, owning. Meredith felt the diamond ring on her finger like a weight dragging her down into dark water. She didn't know that in 3 days a storm would give her one last chance. She didn't know that chance would come in the form of a Navy SEAL and his dog hidden away in the mountains, seeking the same thing she was. Peace. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke on the 3rd night of Jake's isolation. It came from the north, a howling monster of wind and ice that screamed down from the Canadian Rockies like something alive and furious. The temperature plummeted to 15 below zero. The wind shook the cabin's walls, rattling the windows in their frames, driving snow through every tiny crack and crevice. Jake stood by the window, watching the world disappear into white chaos. He had seen sandstorms in Iraq that could strip paint from metal. He had operated in monsoons in Southeast Asia that turned the ground into a river of mud. But this was different. This was nature's own weapon, cold and merciless. Thor paced restlessly, his instincts telling him something was wrong. The dog kept moving to the door, sniffing at the gap beneath it, then returning to Jake's side, a low whine vibrating in his chest. "Easy, boy," Jake said, though he felt it too. The pressure in the air, the sense that the storm was more than just weather. He added more wood to the fire and checked his supplies. He had enough food for 2 weeks, plenty of water from the well, and a generator if the power failed. He was prepared for anything, except what was coming. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Thor's behavior changed. The restless pacing stopped. The dog froze, his entire body rigid, his ears pinned flat against his skull. A growl, deep, primal, threatening, rolled from his chest. Jake's hand moved instantly to the pistol on his hip. His eyes scanned the cabin, then fixed on Thor. The dog wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at the window, at the impenetrable wall of white beyond. "What is it?" Jake's voice was sharp. The operator instantly engaged. Thor's growl intensified. He moved to the door and scratched at it. Once, twice, a demand. Jake trusted his dog more than he trusted his own eyes. If Thor was alerting, there was something out there. In this storm, in this impossible, deadly cold. He pulled on his heavy parka, grabbed his high-powered tactical flashlight, and opened the door. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him backward. Snow drove into his face, stinging like needles. The cold was instant and brutal, stealing his breath. "Thor, with me," he commanded. The dog shot past him into the maelstrom, his copper coat instantly covered in white. Jake followed, the beam of his flashlight cutting a weak, useless cone into the swirling chaos. Visibility was less than 10 feet. Thor was tracking something, his nose low to the ground, his body pushing through drifts that came up to his chest. Jake stayed close, one hand on the dog's harness, trusting Thor's instincts completely. They moved away from the cabin into the thick forest of lodgepole pines. The wind howled through the branches, a sound like the screams of the damned. Jake's face was already going numb, ice forming on his beard. And then Thor stopped. He stood perfectly still, his body tense, and let out a single sharp bark. Jake swept his flashlight forward. At first, he saw nothing, just trees and snow and darkness. Then the beam caught something that didn't belong, a splash of color in the endless white. Red, bright, arterial red against the snow. Blood. Jake's training took over. He moved forward, his hand moving to the rifle slung across his back, his eyes scanning for threats. Thor stayed at his side, positioned between Jake and whatever lay ahead. The blood trail led deeper into the trees. Not a lot of blood, not a fatal amount, but enough to paint a clear story of someone or something wounded, moving, desperate. And then he saw her. She was collapsed against the base of a massive pine tree, half buried in a snowdrift, her body curled into a fetal position. She wore only a thin sweater and jeans, no coat, no boots, just expensive leather shoes that were now soaked through. Her dark hair was matted with snow and ice, her skin a terrifying shade of blue-white. She was dying. Jake was beside her in an instant, his gloved hands checking for a pulse. It was there, faint, thready, far too slow, hypothermia, advanced stage. "Ma'am," he said, his voice sharp and commanding, "can you hear me?" No response. Her eyes were closed, her lips blue, her breathing so shallow he could barely see her chest move. Thor nudged her arm gently, a soft whine escaping. Even the dog understood. This was a victim, not a threat. Jake made his assessment in seconds. She was approximately 5'4", maybe 120 pounds. She'd been out here for at least an hour, maybe more. core temperature was critically low. If he didn't get her warm immediately, she would die. He didn't hesitate. He unzipped his parka, scooped her into his arms. She was so light, so fragile, and wrapped the coat around both of them, pulling her against his chest. He turned back toward the cabin, Thor leading the way, his powerful body breaking trail through the deep snow. The walk back was the longest 200 yards of Jake's life. The woman in his arms was barely conscious, mumbling incoherent words, her body shaking with violent tremors. He could feel her heart beating against his chest, a desperate, fluttering rhythm that was slowing down. "Stay with me," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You don't get to die out here, not on my watch." Thor reached the cabin first and scratched at the door. Jake kicked it open, stumbling inside with his burden. The warmth of the fire hit them like a wall. He laid her down on the thick rug in front of the fireplace and immediately began triage. Her clothes were soaked through, leaching what little heat she had left. He grabbed scissors from his medical kit and cut away the wet sweater and jeans, working with clinical efficiency. He wrapped her in every dry blanket he had, piling them high. Her core temperature was so low that warming her too quickly would kill her. The cold blood from her extremities would rush back to her heart and stop it. He had to be careful, methodical. He heated water on the stove and filled several large bottles, wrapping them in towels and placing them against her torso. Not her arms or legs, but her core. He elevated her feet, covered her head with a dry wool cap. Thor lay down beside her, his warm body pressed against the blankets, a living heat source. Jake watched her breathe. The tremors were good. It meant her body was still fighting, but her eyes remained closed, her face slack. "Who are you?" he whispered, "and what the hell were you running from?" As if in answer, her lips moved. The sound that came out was barely audible, a broken whisper. "Please, don't send me back." And then she was unconscious again, leaving Jake kneeling beside her in the firelight, a stranger he had just saved, and a mystery that was about to shatter his carefully constructed isolation into 1,000 pieces. The night stretched on, measured only by the crackling of the fire and the howling of the storm outside. Jake sat in the wooden chair beside the fireplace, his rifle across his lap, his eyes never leaving the woman on the floor. Thor had taken up position between her and the door, his natural protective instinct engaged. Every 20 minutes, Jake checked her pulse, her breathing, her core temperature with a digital thermometer from his medical kit. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the numbers began to climb. Her lips regained a hint of pink. Her breathing steadied. The violent shivering subsided into occasional tremors. At 3:17 a.m., her eyes opened. They were green, a deep, striking green, and filled with immediate, visceral terror. She gasped, her body jerking as if she'd been struck, her hands coming up defensively. "Easy," Jake said immediately, his voice low and calm, deliberately unthreatening. "You're safe. You're inside. You're warm." She stared at him, her chest heaving, her eyes darting around the cabin, taking in the fire, the blankets, Thor lying beside her, and finally Jake himself, sitting several feet away with his hands visible, non-threatening. "Where?" Her voice was a raw rasp, her throat damaged from the cold. "Where am I?" "You're in my cabin, about 40 miles north of Whitefish. I found you in the woods during the storm." She processed this, her mind clearly struggling through the fog of hypothermia and trauma. She looked down at herself, at the blankets covering her, at her own bare arms beneath. Panic flashed across her face. "Your clothes were soaked?" Jake said quickly, reading her fear. "I had to remove them. You were hypothermic. You would have died." She pulled the blankets tighter around herself, her knuckles white. She was shaken again, but this time it wasn't from cold. It was fear. Jake remained perfectly still, giving her space. He had seen this before, in hostages, in refugees, in victims. The body was present, but the mind was far away, trapped in whatever hell they had escaped from. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "I'm on your side. My name is Jake Mercer. He paused, considering. "I'm military, on leave. That's my dog, Thor. He found you." At the mention of his name, Thor's tail thumped once against the floor. The woman's eyes moved to the dog, and something in her expression softened, just a fraction. Jake pressed on, his voice steady. "You said something before you passed out. You said, 'Don't send me back.' Back where? Who are you running from?" She stared at him for a long moment, her jaw working, clearly debating whether to trust this stranger. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Meredith Hayes, and if you send me back, he will kill me." Jake had heard a lot of stories in his life. He had debriefed hostages, interviewed assets, listened to the desperate pleas of people caught in impossible situations. But there was something in Meredith Hayes's voice, a quiet, absolute certainty that cut through all his training and went straight to something primal. She wasn't hysterical, she wasn't dramatic, she was simply stating a fact. "Who?" he asked. "Marcus Blackwell, my fiancé." The word hit Jake like a punch. Fiancé. Not ex-boyfriend, not abusive husband. Fiancé, present tense, implying this was current, ongoing. "Tell me what happened," Jake said. Not a command, but an invitation. Meredith looked at the fire, her eyes distant. When she spoke, her voice was flat, detached, as if she were reading a report about someone else's life. "We were staying at the Whitefish Mountain Resort. Marcus planned a romantic getaway before the wedding. But it wasn't romantic. It was a prison. He controls everything, where I go, what I wear, who I talk to. He has security, private contractors who follow his orders without question." She paused, swallowing hard. 3 nights ago, we had dinner. Marcus was in a good mood. He drank too much wine. When we got back to our suite, he wanted. She stopped, her hands trembling. Jake said nothing, just listened, his face impassive. "I said I was tired. I asked if we could wait." He smiled. He said, "Of course," and then he locked me in the bedroom. She looked up at Jake, her green eyes hollow. "He locked me in for 2 days. No food, a bottle of water. He said it was to help me understand my priorities." Jake felt a cold, sharp anger settle in his gut. He had seen warlords do this. He had seen terrorists use isolation and starvation as weapons. To hear that an American citizen, a wealthy businessman, was doing it to his own fiancée made his blood run cold. "Tonight," Meredith continued, "there was a gala at the resort. Marcus unlocked the door. He laid out a dress for me. He told me to smile, to be charming, to play the perfect bride-to-be. So I did. I smiled, I laughed, I played my part." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And then, during dinner, the fire alarm went off. It was a false alarm, someone smoking in a room, but everyone evacuated. Marcus was talking to the resort manager. His security team was distracted. And I saw it. The service entrance, the door to the kitchen, leading outside." She looked at Jake, and for the first time, he saw not a victim, but a fighter. "I ran. I didn't have a coat. I didn't have a plan. I just ran into the woods. I thought if I could get far enough, if I could hide, maybe someone would help me. Maybe I could disappear. They came after you, Jake stated. She nodded. His security team. 2 men. I could hear them behind me calling my name, so I ran deeper into the forest. I didn't realize how cold it was. I didn't realize the storm was coming. I just ran until I couldn't run anymore. She pulled the blankets tighter. And then you found me. Jake leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. These security contractors. Did you see their faces? Would you recognize them? Yes, always the same 2. Derek and Paul, ex-military. They do whatever Marcus tells them. And Marcus, does he know where you are? No, I don't think so. The storm was so bad. I covered my tracks as best I could, but... She looked at the window, at the wall of white beyond. When the storm stops, they'll come looking. Marcus doesn't accept failure. He doesn't accept loss. I am his property, and he will get me back. The way she said it, the absolute certainty, told Jake everything he needed to know. This was not paranoia. This was experience. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the storm. The wind was still howling, the snow still falling in thick sheets. They were cut off, isolated, no cell service, no radio, just them and the wilderness, which meant Marcus Blackwell's men couldn't get to them either. Not yet. Meredith, Jake said, turning back to her, you're right. When the storm stops, they will come. But that also means we have time. Time to prepare. Time to get you somewhere safe. Where? She asked, her voice breaking. He has money. He has lawyers. Last time I tried to leave, he had me declared mentally unstable. He had doctors who testified that I was a danger to myself. No one believed me. Jake walked back and knelt down beside her, his eyes level with hers. I believe you, he said simply. Those 3 words hung in the air between them. Meredith's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of profound, overwhelming relief. It was the first time in months that someone had looked at her and seen the truth. Thank you, she whispered. Thor, sensing the shift in emotion, moved closer and rested his head on her lap. She reached out instinctively and buried her fingers in his thick fur, holding on like he was the only solid thing in the world. Jake stood and walked to his gear. He pulled out his satellite phone and checked the signal. Nothing. The storm was too dense, too violent, but when it cleared he would have options. For now, he said, you rest. You're still recovering. When you're strong enough, we'll talk about what comes next. Meredith nodded, exhaustion pulling at her. She lay back down, Thor still beside her, and closed her eyes. Jake returned to his chair, the rifle back across his lap. He didn't sleep. He just watched. The fire, the woman, the storm outside. And he thought about Marcus Blackwell. Men like that, men who used power to hurt the defenseless, were a plague Jake had spent his life fighting. He had hunted them in deserts and jungles and urban hellscapes across the world. He had come to Montana to escape that fight. But the fight, it seemed, had found him anyway. The storm raged for another full day and night, a relentless assault of wind and snow that buried the cabin in drifts 6 feet high. Jake spent the time preparing, checking his weapons, rationing supplies, planning escape routes through terrain he knew only from maps. Meredith slept for most of the first day, her body recovering from the trauma. When she was awake, she stayed wrapped in blankets by the fire, speaking little, watching Jake with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Thor remained her constant companion, sensing her vulnerability. The dog had seen combat, had witnessed human cruelty, and he responded to it the way he had been trained, with protection and unwavering loyalty. On the second night, As the wind finally began to die, Meredith spoke again. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Jake was cleaning his rifle, the familiar ritual grounding him. He looked up, considering the question. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. "But you don't know me. For all you know, I'm lying. Maybe I'm the crazy one Marcus says I am." Jake shook his head. "You're not crazy, and I don't need to know you to know that what he's doing is wrong." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you always the hero?" The question caught him off guard. He thought about Yemen, about the choice he had made, about the faces of the men who hadn't come home. "No," he said quietly, "I'm really not." Something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "What happened to you, Jake Mercer?" He met her gaze. He could have deflected. He could have shut down the conversation. But sitting there in the firelight with a woman who had just shared her deepest trauma, it felt wrong to hide. "I made a call on my last mission," he said. "We had intel that a high-value target was in a compound. But the intel was bad. There were civilians inside, women, children. We had a choice: take the shot or let the target escape." He paused, his hands still on the rifle. "I made the call. We took the shot. We got the target, but we also—" He stopped, unable to finish. "You also killed innocents," Meredith said softly. "No," Jake corrected, his voice tight. "The target killed them. He used them as shields. But that doesn't change the fact that I gave the order. I made the call. And now they're dead." Meredith was silent for a long time. Then she said something that surprised him. "You're carrying weight that isn't yours to carry, Jake. The man who used those people as shields, he's the monster. You were trying to stop him. That doesn't make you a villain. It makes you human." Jake looked at her, this woman who had every reason to hate men, to fear them, and yet she was offering him absolution he didn't feel he deserved. "How do you do that?" he asked. "How do you survive what you've survived and still see the good in people?" She smiled, a sad, broken smile. "Because if I stop seeing the good, then Marcus wins. He wants me to believe the world is cruel and that I'm helpless. Every time I trust someone, every time I fight back, I prove him wrong." In that moment, Jake saw her clearly, not as a victim, but as a warrior fighting her own kind of war. The wind outside finally died. The storm was passing, and with its passing, Jake knew would come Marcus Blackwell's hunters. If this story has you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more incredible true stories of courage and loyalty. The morning after the storm broke was crystalline and brutal. The sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow-covered world in shades of gold and blue, but the temperature had dropped to 20 below. The kind of cold that turned breath to ice crystals, that made metal burn against bare skin. Jake stood on the porch, scanning the forest with his binoculars. The storm had transformed the landscape, burying trails, knocking down trees, creating a pristine white canvas that would reveal any movement. He saw nothing, but Thor was alert, his head raised, his ears swiveling. The dog sensed something Jake couldn't yet see. Inside, Meredith was awake, dressed in clothes Jake had given her, a thermal undershirt, thick wool socks, his spare fleece. They were far too big, but they were warm and dry. She looked small, fragile, but her eyes were clear and focused. "They're coming, aren't they?" she asked. "Probably," Jake said, not sugarcoating it. "The storm kept them away, but now it's clear, If they're professionals, they'll start searching the most likely areas. Old logging roads, hunting cabins, anywhere someone might take shelter. This cabin, Meredith said, is it registered? Does anyone know you're here? It's a private rental, off the books, but in a search grid, they'll find it eventually. Meredith wrapped her arms around herself. So, what do we do? Jake had been thinking about this all night, running scenarios, calculating odds. We have two options. We can run, try to get to Whitefish before they find us, or we can stay and defend. Which is better? Running means we're exposed, vulnerable on the road. They could have vehicles, air support. We'd be easy targets. He looked at her. Defending means we use the terrain to our advantage. This cabin is isolated, defensible. We have high ground, clear sight lines. But we'd be trapped, Meredith said. Only if we lose, Jake replied. She stared at him, the weight of the situation sinking in. You really think you can stop them? Marcus's men are professionals. They're armed. There are at least 2 of them, maybe more. Jake checked the magazine in his rifle, his movements calm and practiced. I've faced worse odds. But what if... She stopped, her voice catching. What if you get hurt? What if something happens to you because of me? Jake looked at her, and for the first time since he'd found her, he allowed himself to really see her. Not as a mission, not as a victim to protect, but as a person. A brave, terrified, remarkable person who had run barefoot into a blizzard rather than accept her own destruction. Meredith, he said quietly, I didn't pull you out of that snow just to hand you back. This is personal now. Before she could respond, Thor let out a low, warning growl. Jake's head snapped toward the window. He moved silently to the edge, peering through the gap in the curtains. There, about 400 yards down the snow-covered access road, 2 figures moving on foot. They wore heavy winter tactical gear, white camouflage parkas over body armor. One carried a rifle. The other had binoculars, scanning the trees. They're here, Jake said, his voice ice-cold calm. Meredith's face went white. That's them, Derek and Paul, Marcus's men. Jake watched them move. They were careful, professional, but they weren't expecting resistance. They were hunting a frightened, unarmed woman. They thought this would be easy. Meredith, Jake said, not taking his eyes off the approaching men, I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Yes, she whispered. Good. Go into the bathroom. It's the interior room. No windows, reinforced walls. Take Thor with you. Lock the door. No matter what you hear, you don't come out until I tell you. Understood? She nodded, her eyes wide. Thor, Jake commanded. Guard. The dog immediately moved to Meredith's side, his body pressed against her leg. Go, Jake said. Meredith fled to the bathroom, Thor following. Jake heard the lock click. He was alone now. Just him and 2 armed professionals who had no idea what they were walking into. Jake moved with lethal efficiency. He positioned his rifle by the window, his pistol on his hip. He killed the fire, plunging the cabin into cold dimness. He opened the door just a crack, creating a fatal funnel. Anyone coming through would be backlit, exposed. Then he waited. The 2 men approached slowly, their weapons up. Jake watched them through the scope of his rifle. The taller one, Derek, he assumed, was on point, moving with the practiced caution of former military. The second, Paul, covered their 6, his head constantly swiveling. They stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. Derek raised a gloved hand, signaling a halt. He lifted his binoculars, scanning the structure. Jake held his breath, perfectly still. Derek lowered the binoculars and said something to Paul. Jake couldn't hear the words, but he saw Paul nod. They were making a plan. Derek began to circle left, moving to flank the cabin. Paul stayed in position, providing overwatch. Standard two-man clear. They were going to breach from multiple angles. Jake let Derek move, let him get closer, let him believe he was in control. When Derek was 20 yards from the side window, Jake made his move. He stepped out onto the porch, his rifle shouldered, his stance perfect. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud. It didn't need to be. It carried the absolute authority of command. That's far enough. Both men froze. Derek's head whipped around, his rifle coming up. Paul, still 50 yards out, brought his weapon to bear. "We don't want trouble," Derek called out, his voice muffled by his face mask. "We're just looking for someone, a woman. She's confused, disoriented. We're here to help her." "You're not helping anyone," Jake said. "You're trespassing, and you're going to leave. Now." Derek's eyes narrowed, assessing. He saw one man, alone, in civilian clothes. No body armor, no backup, just a rifle and confidence. "Friend," Derek said, his tone shifting to something harder. "You don't know who you're dealing with. This doesn't concern you. Walk away." Jake's response was to chamber around, the metallic sound sharp and final in the cold air. "You have 3 seconds to turn around." Paul, still at a distance, shifted his weight, his finger moving toward his trigger. "1," Jake said. Derek's face hardened. He was ex-military. Jake could see it in his stance, his discipline. But he was also arrogant. He believed numbers and equipment trumped skill. 2. "You're making a mistake," Derek said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Jake didn't say 3. He didn't need to. What happened next took less than 4 seconds. Derek moved first, bringing his rifle up, his finger tightening on the trigger. It was a clean, professional motion, fast, decisive. It wasn't fast enough. Jake's shot was surgical. The round hit Derek's rifle's upper receiver, destroying the weapon without touching the man. The rifle was torn from Derek's hands, the impact spinning him sideways. He hit the snow hard, gasping. Paul, seeing his partner go down, opened fire. 3 rapid shots, the bullets tearing through the air where Jake had been standing. Jake had already moved. He dropped off the porch, using the cabin structure for cover, and sprinted toward the tree line to his left. Paul adjusted, tracking his movement, firing again. The rounds chewed through the logs behind Jake, splinters exploding. Jake hit the trees and disappeared. Paul was in the open now, his position exposed. He spun, trying to locate his target, his breathing loud and ragged in his throat. From the shadows of the forest, Jake's voice came, calm and cold. "You're making a choice right now, Paul. You can help your friend and leave, or you can die in the snow. What's it going to be?" Paul's head jerked toward the sound, his rifle swinging. He fired blindly into the trees, panic replacing discipline. "Where are you?" Paul screamed. "Show yourself!" And then Thor came. The dog had been waiting for his moment, silent and invisible in the thick underbrush. At Jake's whispered command, a single word in German, Thor launched himself from the darkness. Paul saw the streak of copper and black a heartbeat too late. Thor hit him low, going for the leg, not to maim, but to disable. 80 pounds of muscle and momentum took Paul down like a felled tree. His rifle flew from his hands, disappearing into the snow. Thor stood over him, teeth bared, a growl that vibrated the air. Paul lay still, his eyes wide with terror, staring into the face of a predator. Jake emerged from the trees, his rifle trained on Paul's chest. He walked over to Derek, who was still on the ground, clutching his bruised ribs. "Both of you," Jake said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Take off your tactical gear. Coats, vests, weapons. Leave it in the snow." "You can't," Derek started. Jake fired a round into the snow inches from Derek's head. The man flinched, his bravado evaporating. "I can," Jake said, "and I will. Strip. Now." 5 minutes later, Derek and Paul stood in the freezing cold in only their base layers, shivering violently. Their weapons, their armor, their comms gear, all of it was piled in the snow at Jake's feet. Jake held up a satellite radio he'd taken from Derek's gear. "You're going to call your boss. You're going to tell him that Meredith Hayes is under federal protection. You're going to tell him that if he comes anywhere near her again, I will make sure every law enforcement agency in the country knows what he's done." Derek's jaw clenched. "Marcus Blackwell will bury you. He has lawyers, connections. I don't care," Jake interrupted. "Make the call." Derek took the radio, his hands shaking from cold and rage. He keyed the mic. "This is Derek. We lost her. She's with someone. Military. He says she's protected." There was a pause, then a voice came through the radio. It was smooth, cultured, and absolutely furious. "Put him on." Derek held out the radio to Jake. Jake took it, keying the mic. "Marcus Blackwell," Jake said. "My name is Senior Chief Jake Mercer, United States Navy. Meredith Hayes is safe. She is not coming back. And if you send anyone else after her, I will personally ensure that your life becomes very, very difficult." The voice that came back was cold. "You have no idea what you've done, Chief. I will ruin you. I will ruin her. You've just made a very powerful enemy." "Good," Jake said. "I collect them." He tossed the radio into the snow and looked at Derek and Paul. "You have a long walk back to town. I suggest you start now before you freeze to death." The two men stumbled away, their forms already shaking violently from the cold. They would make it, barely, but they would carry the message. Jake watched them disappear into the trees, then turned back to the cabin. Meredith was standing on the porch, Thor at her side. She had heard everything through the thin walls. Tears were streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief. "It's over?" she whispered. "Not yet," Jake said, walking toward her. "But it's started." He had just declared war on one of the most powerful men in Montana. And he didn't regret it for a second. The cabin felt different now. What had been a sanctuary of isolation had become a fortress under siege. Jake moved through the space with tactical precision, securing the weapons he'd taken from Derek and Paul, checking ammunition counts, establishing a defense perimeter. Meredith sat at the small wooden table, a mug of hot coffee clutched in her trembling hands. She was in shock, not from fear, but from the sudden disorienting feeling of hope. "He's not going to stop," she said quietly. "Marcus doesn't accept defeat. If he can't send his security team, he'll find another way." Jake was checking the satellite phone, waiting for a signal. The storm had damaged the relay, but it was slowly coming back online. "I'm counting on it," he said. Meredith looked up at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Marcus Blackwell just made a critical mistake. He sent armed men onto private property to abduct someone against their will. He did it with witnesses, and now I have his confession on record." Jake held up the satellite radio he'd taken from Derek. "This records everything, including the part where he threatened a federal agent." You're not really a federal agent," Meredith said. No, Jake agreed, but he doesn't know that. And more importantly, I can make sure people who are federal agents know about him. The satellite phone finally chirped. A weak signal, but it was enough. Jake dialed a number he knew by heart. The voice that answered was gruff, tired. "This better be important, Mercer. It's 0500. "Commander," Jake said, his tone formal, "I need a favor." Lieutenant Commander Sarah Voss was Jake's former team leader, a woman who had spent 20 years in naval special warfare and had seen every kind of crisis. She was also the person Jake trusted most in the world. "What kind of favor?" she asked, instantly alert. "The kind that involves civilians, domestic law enforcement, and a very rich, very dangerous man who thinks he's above the law." There was a pause. "Where are you, Jake?" "Montana, Whitefish area, and I'm going to need you to call in some markers with the FBI." For the next 10 minutes, Jake laid out the situation: Meredith's captivity, Marcus Blackwell's abuse, the armed contractors, the threats. He transmitted the audio file from the satellite radio, Marcus's own voice condemning him. Commander Voss listened without interrupting. When Jake finished, she was silent for a moment. "Jake," she said carefully, "are you sure about this? Getting involved in a domestic situation, confronting armed contractors, this isn't your fight." "It is now," Jake said simply. Another pause. Then, "All right, I'll make the calls, but it's going to take time. Maybe 48 hours before federal agents can get there. Can you hold your position until then?" "Affirmative." "And Jake?" Her voice softened. "Are you okay? Really?" Jake looked at Meredith, at Thor lying protectively at her feet, at the weapons stacked by the door. "I'm better than I was," he said. After he ended the call, Meredith spoke. 48 hours. That's a long time. What if Marcus doesn't wait?" Jake sat down across from her. "Then we'll deal with it. But Meredith, I need you to understand something. This isn't just about keeping you away from him anymore. This is about stopping him. Permanently." "How?" she asked. "He has money, lawyers. He has arrogance," Jake interrupted. "And arrogance makes people careless. He's already made mistakes. Now we're going to force him to make more." That night, as the temperature dropped and the cabin settled into uneasy quiet, Meredith finally asked the question that had been weighing on her. "Why are you doing this, Jake? Really? You could have just called the police. You could have handed me off and walked away." Jake was cleaning his rifle, the familiar ritual helping him think. He didn't look up when he answered. "Because I've spent 15 years fighting monsters overseas," he said. "And I came home to realize we have them here too. Maybe they wear suits instead of carrying AKs. Maybe they use lawyers instead of bombs. But they're still monsters." He paused, his hands stilling on the weapon. "And because I'm tired of failing people." Meredith heard the weight in his voice. "Yemen," she said softly. "The mission you told me about." "Yeah. You didn't fail, Jake. You made an impossible choice. Tell that to the families of the people who died." Meredith stood and walked over to him. She knelt down beside his chair, looking up at him until he met her eyes. "You didn't kill them, Jake. The monster did, and you stopped him from killing more. That matters." "Does it?" Jake's voice was raw. "Because I keep seeing their faces. I keep hearing the silence after the explosion. And I don't know how to make it stop." Meredith reached out and placed her hand over his, stilling his restless movement. "Maybe you make it stop by saving people. By being the protector instead of the weapon. by choosing to see the good fight instead of just the fight. Jake looked down at her hand on his, small, delicate, but strong. He thought about the choice she had made, running into a blizzard rather than accepting defeat. He thought about her courage, her resilience. "You're tougher than you look, Meredith Hayes," he said quietly. She smiled, a real smile, the first he'd seen from her. "So are you, Jake Mercer." Thor, lying nearby, lifted his head and gave a soft chuff, as if agreeing. For the first time in months, Jake felt something other than guilt and exhaustion. He felt purpose. The next 36 hours were a waiting game. Jake maintained a constant watch, rotating between observation points around the cabin. Thor patrolled the perimeter, his senses far more reliable than any camera system. Meredith, for her part, began to emerge from her shell. She helped Jake prepare meals, asked questions about his training, and even managed to laugh when Thor stole a piece of jerky from the counter. But underneath the fragile domesticity, they both knew the storm was coming. It arrived on the second night. Jake was on the porch, scanning the forest with night vision goggles when Thor alerted. The dog's ears went flat, his body rigid, a low growl building. Jake keyed his handheld radio, the one he'd taken from Derek, to the frequency Blackwell's team had been using. Static, then voices. Position at ridgeline, visual on structure, looks occupied. Jake's blood ran cold. This wasn't Derek and Paul. This was a new team. He moved quickly inside. "Meredith, we have company, multiple contacts. This is it." Her face went pale, but she nodded. "What do I do?" "Same as before. Bathroom, lock the door, Thor with you." "Jake? Now, Meredith." She ran. Thor followed. Jake heard the lock click. He moved to the window and raised his night vision. What he saw made his jaw clench. 4 men, all in tactical gear, moving in a diamond formation. They had learned from Derek and Paul's failure. These weren't bodyguards. These were professional contractors, likely former special operations, and they were approaching with lethal intent. Jake checked his weapons. Rifle, pistol, 3 fragmentation grenades he'd taken from the tactical gear, and 30 rounds of spare ammunition. 4 on 1, in the dark, in confined terrain. He'd faced worse odds in Fallujah. The men reached the clearing around the cabin and stopped. One raised a bullhorn. "Jake Mercer," the voice boomed. "We know you're in there. We know you have Meredith Hayes. Mr. Blackwell is prepared to be reasonable. Send her out, and you can walk away from this." Jake didn't respond. He was moving, repositioning, setting up his first trap. "You have 30 seconds, Mercer. Then we come in." Jake smiled in the darkness. "Come ahead," he whispered. He had chosen this ground carefully. The cabin might look vulnerable, but it was actually a killing box. The approaches were limited, the windows were reinforced, and Jake had spent the last 2 days preparing surprises. When the 30 seconds expired, the team moved. 2 headed for the front door, 2 for the back. The front team never made it. As they crossed the porch, a tripwire, fine fishing line nearly invisible, caught the lad man's boot. The fragmentation grenade Jake had rigged detonated with a deafening bang. The concussive force threw both men backward, stunning them, their night vision shattering. The back team heard the explosion and rushed forward, abandoning caution. Jake was waiting. He fired through a gun port he'd cut in the back wall, 3 controlled shots. The first hit the lead man's weapon, destroying it. The second and third hit the snow at their feet, sending up geysers of powder and forcing them to dive for cover. "Thor, now!" Jake commanded. The bathroom door exploded open, and Thor shot out like a missile. But he wasn't heading for the fight. He was heading for the tree line, drawing fire, creating chaos. The back team split. One chased the dog, the other pressed toward the cabin. Jake moved to intercept. He kicked open the back door and came out low, his rifle up. The contractor was skilled. He pivoted, bringing his weapon around, but Jake was faster. A single shot to the man's body armor. The impact knocked him flat, the wind driven from his lungs. Jake was on him instantly, stripping the rifle, zip-tying his wrists with brutal efficiency. The front team was recovering, shouting into their radios. Jake heard the word he'd been waiting for. "Abort! Abort! This is a goddamn trap!" They were retreating. But Jake wasn't finished. He grabbed the bullhorn from the stunned contractor at his feet and keyed it on. "You tell Marcus Blackwell," his voice boomed across the clearing, "that the next team he sends won't be coming home at all. This is my line, and I will hold it." Silence. Then the sound of engines starting, vehicles pulling back. Thor emerged from the trees, panting, unharmed. He trotted back to Jake and sat, his tail wagging once. "Good boy," Jake said, scratching his ears. Meredith appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide. Did we win?" "We survived," Jake corrected. "The win comes later." The federal agents arrived at dawn, just as Commander Voss had promised. 3 black SUVs rolled up the access road, followed by a Montana State Police cruiser. The lead agent was a woman named Karen Chen, FBI, Violent Crimes Division, and she took one look at the scene and let out a low whistle. "Chief Mercer?" she asked, approaching cautiously. Jake stood on the porch, Thor at his side. "That's me." Agent Chen looked at the tactical gear piled in the snow, the zip-tied contractor still lying where Jake had left him, and the blast marks from the grenade. "You've had an eventful week. You could say that." Over the next hour, Jake walked Agent Chen through everything. Meredith's escape, the pursuit, the confrontations, and most importantly, the recorded evidence of Marcus Blackwell's threats and criminal conspiracy. Meredith gave her statement, her voice stronger now, more confident. She detailed years of abuse, isolation, and control. She provided bank records she'd secretly copied, showing how Marcus had used his wealth to manipulate authorities, to pay off doctors and lawyers who would testify to her instability. Agent Chen listened, her expression growing harder with each revelation. "Ms. Hayes," she said finally, "what Marcus Blackwell did to you is criminal. Unlawful imprisonment, assault, conspiracy to commit kidnapping. We have enough here to bring charges, federal charges." "Will it stick?" Meredith asked, fear creeping back into her voice. "He's so powerful. He had, Agent Chen corrected. He had power, but that power was built on secrecy and fear. You just took that away, and Chief Mercer here made sure we have evidence that will stand up in any court." She looked at Jake. "You know, you could have been charged with assault, Chief, taking down armed contractors on private land." "Self-defense," Jake said calmly. "They were trespassing. They were armed. They threatened a civilian under my protection. Everything I did was within my rights as a property owner defending against a home invasion." Agent Chen smiled slightly. "Convenient that you'd rented this cabin, isn't it?" "Very," Jake agreed. "Well," Agent Chen said, "I can't argue with the results, but I'd appreciate it if you let us handle it from here. Can you do that?" Jake looked at Meredith. She nodded, trusting him. "As long as she's safe," Jake said, "I'm done fighting." 2 days later, Marcus Blackwell was arrested at his penthouse in Seattle. The arrest was public, humiliating, and absolute. Cameras captured him being led out in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled, his perfect hair disheveled. The charges were extensive: unlawful imprisonment, aggravated assault, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. His lawyers tried to fight it. They tried to claim Meredith was unstable, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. But then Jake's testimony came out. A Navy SEAL, a decorated war hero, describing in clinical detail how he'd found a woman dying in the snow, how armed contractors had tried to abduct her, how Marcus Blackwell himself had threatened federal action. The lawyers went quiet. Marcus Blackwell's empire began to crumble. Business partners distanced themselves. Board members resigned. His philanthropic foundations launched internal investigations. And Meredith Hayes, for the first time in 3 years, could breathe. 3 weeks later, Jake stood on the same porch where he'd first confronted Derek and Paul. The snow was melting now, revealing the brown earth beneath. Spring was coming to Montana. A car pulled up the access road, not a tactical vehicle, not law enforcement, just a simple rental sedan. Meredith got out, and Thor immediately bounded down the steps to greet her, tail wagging furiously. She knelt and buried her face in his fur, laughing. "I missed you too, boy." Jake walked down to meet her. She looked different, stronger, healthier. Her hair was shorter, cut in a practical style. She wore jeans and a simple sweater. No designer clothes, no massive engagement ring, just herself. "How are you?" Jake asked. "Free," she said simply. "The restraining order is permanent. Marcus is awaiting trial, and his lawyers are negotiating a plea deal. He'll do time, real time." "Good." They walked together toward the edge of the forest, where the afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds. "I wanted to thank you," Meredith said, "for everything. You didn't have to help me. You could have walked away." "I couldn't," Jake said. "Not after finding you. Not after knowing what he'd done." Meredith stopped and turned to face him. "I also wanted to tell you something. You said you failed people in Yemen. You said you couldn't make peace with what happened." Jake's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "You didn't fail them, Jake. You made the best choice you could with impossible options. And the fact that it haunts you, that it matters to you, that's what makes you a good man, not a bad one." She reached out and took his hand. "You saved my life. Not just from the cold, from him, from a future where I would have disappeared entirely. You gave me back myself. That's not failure, that's heroism." Jake looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. He saw no pity there, no empty platitude, just truth. "Maybe," he said quietly, "maybe we saved each other." Thor barked once, as if agreeing, and they both laughed. 6 months later, Jake was back with his team, preparing for another deployment. But something had changed. The guilt that had weighed on him, the constant replay of Yemen, had softened. He still remembered the mission. He always would. But now, when he thought about it, he also thought about Meredith running through a blizzard, refusing to give up. He thought about her courage, her resilience, her choice to keep fighting, and he thought about the words Commander Voss had told him after his testimony at Marcus Blackwell's trial. "You're a protector, Jake. That's who you are. Sometimes protecting people means making impossible choices, but it always means standing up when no one else will." The mission still mattered, but now Jake understood why. Not for glory, not for medals, not even for duty, but for the people like Meredith, for the defenseless, for the ones who couldn't fight back. That was worth fighting for. Meredith Hayes stood in front of a packed auditorium, her hands steady on the podium. She was testifying before a congressional committee on domestic violence and coercive control, telling her story, not as a victim, but as a survivor. In the audience sat Jake Mercer in his dress blues and Thor at his feet. They had been given special permission to attend. When Meredith finished her testimony, the room erupted in applause. She stepped down from the podium, and as she passed Jake's seat, she paused. "Thank you," she mouthed. Jake nodded once, a warrior's salute to a fellow fighter. Outside the Capitol building, a reporter approached Jake. "Chief Mercer, can you comment on your role in the Blackwell case?" Jake looked at Thor, then at the reporter. "I was just a man who found someone who needed help. That's all. Any one of us would have done the same." But as he walked away, he knew that wasn't quite true. Not everyone would have run into the storm. Not everyone would have stood their ground against overwhelming force. Not everyone would have chosen to fight when it would have been easier to look away. But Jake had. And in doing so, he had found something he'd been searching for since Yemen. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the peace that comes from knowing you fought for the right reasons, that you protected someone who needed protecting, that you made a difference. The mountains of Montana had given him that gift, and he would carry it with him, wherever the mission took him next. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that heroes still exist. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments. What was your favorite moment? Was it Thor's loyalty, Jake's protection, or the moment Meredith found her courage? We read every comment. This story reminds us that true heroism isn't about being fearless. It's about choosing to act when fear would be easier. It's about standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. In a world that often feels dark and overwhelming, stories like this remind us that good people still exist, that warriors still walk among us, ready to defend the defenseless, that one person, one choice, one moment of courage can change everything. Military working dogs like Thor serve alongside our bravest warriors, risking everything to keep us safe. And men and women like Jake Mercer carry burdens we can barely imagine, making impossible choices so we don't have to. If you've ever felt powerless, remember Meredith, who ran barefoot into a blizzard rather than accept defeat. If you've ever felt haunted by your past, remember Jake, who found redemption by choosing to protect instead of destroy. God bless our service members, our military working dogs, and everyone who stands between the innocent and those who would do them harm. See you in the next story.